Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller.
An obsession for efficiency.
When one talks about the titans of American industry, two names probably come to mind more than any other. Andrew Carnegie, who was the master of American steel at a time when steel was the preeminent basic industry in American economic life, and John D. Rockefeller, whose name became synonymous with the petroleum industry. Carnegie and John Rockefeller were almost perfect contemporaries. They were both born in the mid-1830s. They came of age during the early years of the American Industrial Revolution. They weren't the first revolutionaries. They weren't the first to the ramparts in the Industrial Revolution. They were the second generation. They were the heirs. Now, I need to say a word about the Industrial Revolution because the success of Carnegie and John Rockefeller can't be understood without this background. And at the same time, the development of the American economy requires an understanding of what the American Industrial Revolution was all about. The Industrial Revolution, in its most basic sense, was the application of machinery to tasks that had been done by hand for generations or maybe even centuries or millennia. In a more specific sense, it was the application of steam power and then electrical power and then the power of internal combustion engines to the industrial process. Now, we need to bear in mind that unlike, and I mentioned this in an earlier lecture, unlike a political revolution, which usually has a particular starting date, the Industrial Revolution was something that evolved over time. It would probably be better to talk about the industrial evolution, but that doesn't have quite the dramatic flair to it. And also, it doesn't really get across the degree to which the Industrial Revolution changed people's lives. Because the Industrial Revolution probably changed people's lives in countries like the United States more than just about anything ever in history. It didn't do it overnight, but it was such a dramatic change that it does deserve the name revolution. The Industrial Revolution did not originate in America. It began in Britain in the mid to late 18th century. That is, in the period really starting just around the time of the American Revolution, 1760s, 1770s, 1780s. It began with the invention of the steam engine by James Watt and others, and the application of steam technology in the textile industry. This was one of the first places that it was applied, as the machinery in textile mills began to be operated by steam. Machinery that had often been operated before by the power of falling water, thereby constraining the mills to be located at places where water fell, over rapids, over waterfalls. But with the development of steam technology, the factories could be located anywhere. The second novel application of steam power was in the field of transport. First in steamboats, then steamships, and then railroads. So that by the early 19th century, by the 1810s, 1820s, 1830s, railroads were coming into common usage in Britain, and steamboats were being used around Britain, and even more in the United States, and then steamships for ocean-going travel. The Industrial Revolution leaped the Atlantic Ocean in the first half of the 19th century. It came to America in the form of steamships, in the form of steam power for textile mills, of which there were many in New England, and especially in the form of railroads. The first major modern industry in the United States was the railroad industry. In the last lecture, I talked about how Cornelius Vanderbilt really followed the change in American transport technology from sailboats to steamboats to steamships to railroads. By the time he got into railroads, the United States was fully into the Industrial Revolution. And it was prepared for the next stage of the Industrial Revolution, the application of steam power and other forms of fossil fuel power to the industrial process itself. And it was at this point that both Andrew Carnegie and John Rockefeller come to the fore. Andrew Carnegie was the classic case of the immigrant kid who comes to America and makes good. Carnegie was the son of a linen worker in Scotland, a linen worker who decided to emigrate when the Industrial Revolution in Britain displaced him. He was a linen weaver who had been weaving by hand. But once the textile business, once the linen industry in Britain became automated with the application of steam power, Andrew Carnegie's father was thrown out of work. He couldn't find any work in Scotland. He became somewhat depressed. Andrew Carnegie's mother at this point essentially took charge of the family and says, "We're going to America. There's more opportunity in America." So the Carnegies got on board a ship, traveled across the Atlantic, and when Andy Carnegie, young Andy, was 12 years old, they arrived in America. They had relatives living in the vicinity of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and so to Pittsburgh they went. Andrew Carnegie was one who at the age of 12 was told that the family could no longer afford to have him in school. He needed to go to work. His father, and this is one of those cases where the generational changes reveal themselves in the ability to adapt to changing circumstances. Andrew Carnegie's father never did adapt to life in America, never did adapt to life in the industrial age, never really did find serious and permanent employment. So that left it to Andy, the 12-year-old kid, to support the family. He first got a job as a bobbin boy in a factory that made bobbins, and he had to dip them in this oil bath to clean off the metal filings and the like. And that lasted for several months. It often gave him nightmares because as a young boy, he was responsible for the boiler that heated up the oil, and he had nightmares about how the boiler would explode and all sorts of people would be killed. It's probably worth bearing in mind, worth remembering here, that the industrial process in America, the industrialization process, was one that was very hard on people, very hard on the workers, and working in factories could be a very dangerous sort of job. Now, Andrew Carnegie, in fact, did not blow up the bobbin factory and didn't kill himself, but he decided that he was going to get out. He got another job, one that turned out to be much more suited to one of his talents and ambitions. He was hired on as a messenger boy for a telegraph company. This telegraph company had Carnegie sending messages, carrying messages all around Pittsburgh. It so happened that Pittsburgh was the headquarters of the Pennsylvania Railroad. And Tom Scott, who was the director of the Penn, the president of the Pennsylvania Railroad, saw that Andrew Carnegie, as a boy in his young teens, was a very clever lad, and so he offered a job as his assistant, his office assistant, to Andrew Carnegie. So Andrew Carnegie, in the 1840s and early 1850s, went to work for the Pennsylvania Railroad. The Pennsylvania Railroad was the leading railroad in America. Tom Scott was the leading railroad executive. It was exactly the place to be for someone who hoped to make his career in American business at that time. Andrew Carnegie took great advantage of the opportunity. He learned the intricacies of the railroad business. He became Tom Scott's essential right arm. One of the things that Scott had to do, one of the things that Scott's office had to do, was to keep the traffic flowing on the various lines of the Pennsylvania Railroad. One day, Andrew Carnegie came into work early. Tom Scott wasn't around. He was out of the office. And word arrived that there had been a very bad accident on one of the Penn's lines. Andrew Carnegie decided that he was going to take the initiative and take responsibility for rerouting the traffic around the accident, for getting the trains up and running again. He, operating on his own authority, well, actually on the forged authority, he forged Tom Scott's signature on a number of orders that he sent out. But here's this kid who's barely 20 years old, who is basically operating America's largest railroad. Think in terms of an air traffic controller today. This is probably the best analogy, because operating a rail network in those days was very much like it. There were tens of thousands of dollars at risk here. For every hour that the railroads didn't meet their schedules, they would lose money. Businesses would lose money. There were also lives at stake here, because it was necessary to keep the trains off of, needless to say, a track can't be operated by two trains at the same time. But Andrew Carnegie decided that he was going to get the trains up and running again. He did successfully, absolutely astonishing those people who knew that it was just a kid who was doing this. But it didn't actually astonish Tom Scott, who wasn't surprised at all. Scott came to work. Tom Scott, the president of the Penn, comes to work, and he realizes what Andrew Carnegie has done. Carnegie later describes the reaction. He's talking about Scott. This is Carnegie speaking. "He looked in my face for a second. I scarcely dared look in his. I did not know what was going to happen. He did not say one word. But he allowed Carnegie's orders out to the various people on the rail line to stand, and he later bragged to his colleagues about the ability and ambition of Andrew Carnegie. And he reportedly told to one of his associates, he said, "Do you know what that little white-haired Scotch devil of mine did? Well, I'm blamed if he didn't run every train on the division in my name without the slightest authority." This individual said, "Well, did he do it right?" "Oh, yes," said Tom Scott. "He did it right." And ever after, Andrew Carnegie had a reputation around the Penn Railroad as someone who could act on his own authority and get things done. And his future in the Penn Railroad was made from that point on. But it was a mark of Andrew Carnegie's ambition that he himself didn't see his future working for the Penn Railroad. In fact, he didn't see his future working for anybody else. He ultimately wanted to get out on his own, and he began making it possible for himself to do that. He invested money in an express company that did business with the railroad. This allowed him to make his first $600, as he later said, when he found the joys of making money through investment rather than as wages or salary. He said, "Eureka! Here's the goose that lays the golden eggs." Now, he left unsaid an aspect of this transaction that simply wouldn't stand muster today, and that is he was engaged in a conflict of interest as well as some insider trading. He heard that this particular company, the express company that he bought stock in, was about to land a contract that was going to be greatly advantageous and would boost profits. He had this from insiders who knew about this. Carnegie didn't bother telling anybody, bought stock, and watched the values of his share go sharply up. I mention this because it's another example of how the rules change over time. In those days, when Carnegie made the investment was based on this insider information. There was nothing illegal about it. And even years later, when he wrote his autobiography and described this transaction, it still wasn't illegal, and he didn't feel that there was anything that needed to be hidden or explained away. This was simply the way business was done. Smart people, bright people, would find information that they would use to their advantage. Now, later on in the 20th century, this sort of insider trading, as it would come to be called, was made illegal, and people would go to jail for insider trading. But in those days, it was considered perfectly appropriate, and it was simply the advantage that people got from having their eyes open and their ear to the ground. Carnegie continued to invest, in this case, in a second case, in a transaction, an enterprise with Tom Scott, the president of Penn. This was one in which they were investing in a company that made railroad sleeping cars, and railroad sleeping cars that the Penn was going to purchase. Well, here again, it's a clear conflict of interest. The president of the Penn Railroad, Tom Scott, and his right-hand man, Andrew Carnegie, are investing in a company that is going to make most of its money by selling its product to the Penn. These days, it would be considered certainly illegal, definitely unethical, for engaging in such conflict of interest transactions. But in those days, that's the way business was done. Andrew Carnegie realized, however, that his future lay not in the express business, not in the sleeping car business, not even in the railroad business. He wanted to get into something more basic. He had some money to invest as a result of his profits from these earlier investments, and he decided that he was going to go into the construction of iron bridges. Until now, most railroad bridges, most highway bridges, to the extent that there were any highway bridges, were of masonry construction, which limited how big they could be, how broad a river they could span. But beginning in the 1830s and 1840s, construction engineers began experimenting with the use of iron and steel. And Carnegie saw that that was the direction that construction was going to go. And so he decided that he was going to get into the construction business. He bought a large portion of a company that built iron and steel bridges. It was Carnegie's company that was responsible for building some of the most important bridges, for providing the iron and structural steel for some of the most important bridges in America during this time. The Eads Bridge over the Mississippi River. This was the first bridge to span the Mississippi anywhere below its headwaters. And the Brooklyn Bridge, the famous bridge that was built in New York in the 1880s. Carnegie then realized that if a person could make money in the iron and steel bridge business, there was potentially even more money to be made in the iron and steel business itself. Carnegie had this knack, you might call it a preoccupation, with moving upstream in whatever industry he was in. And so he realized that any business that depended on another business for its raw materials could be a business that could be turned into a profit. And so from the iron and steel bridge business, he went into the iron and steel business. And he purchased what came to be called the Carnegie Steel Company. And he decided at that point that it was time to get out of all of his other business ventures. He came to what he believed was one of his basic principles of business success. And considering the fact that Andrew Carnegie was one of the preeminent successes in American business, it's probably worth reading what he has to say about the road to success. This is Andrew Carnegie and his fundamental principle of business success. Put all your eggs in one basket and then watch that basket. This was the shorthand version of Carnegie's rule or secret of his success. In his autobiography, he elaborated on this principle. I'll quote here. I believe the true road to preeminent success in any line is to make yourself master in that line. I have no faith in the policy of scattering one's resources, and in my experience, I have rarely, if ever, met a man who achieved preeminence in money-making, certainly never one in manufacturing, who was interested in many concerns. The men who have succeeded are men who have chosen one line and stuck to it. My advice to young men would be not only to concentrate their whole time and attention on the one business in life in which they engage, but to put every dollar of their capital into it. Now, this is advice that Andrew Carnegie is giving in the latter half of the 19th century. It's worth noting that it stands in sharp contrast to the approach of John Jacob Astor. Astor achieved success by diversifying. Carnegie says that success lies in concentrating. To some extent, this reflects the difference in their personalities, but to a larger degree, it reflects the difference in the stage of evolution of the American economy. In Astor's day, a person could get into commerce, even the China trade, the fur trade, a person could get into real estate without any special expertise, without an enormous amount of capital required. In Carnegie's day, industrial development had evolved to a point where, to be the master of steel, as Carnegie became, one had to focus everything on that particular enterprise. There was no room for diversifying. There was no room for scattering one's resources or diluting one's attention. Andrew Carnegie became the preeminent steelmaker in America primarily because of his attention to the costs of production. He insisted on having the most efficient steel plants. Here's Carnegie describing his philosophy of production. Quote, "Show me your cost sheets. It is more interesting to know how well and how cheaply you have done this thing than how much money you have made. Because the one, that is the money, the profits, is a temporary result due possibly to special conditions of trade. But the other, that is the cost, means a permanency that will go on with the works as long as they last." His rule of thumb was drive your costs down, make your production as efficient as possible, and the profits will take care of themselves. It certainly worked for Andrew Carnegie, who by the time he was 40 years old, controlled the lion's share of the American steel industry. And by the beginning of the 20th century, when he was in his 60s and ready to retire, he was really the master of steel. Carnegie was one of the wealthiest men in America, and his name was a watchword for industrial efficiency. In his latter years, at the time of his retirement, he summed up in a very neat way what the steel industry was all about. It captures his philosophy of business it also captures an important element of American industry at this point, and that was its ability to fabricate basic raw materials into the raw materials of industry. Here's Carnegie describing all you need to know about the steel business. It's a somewhat extended quote, but it's worth listening to, I think. Here's Carnegie. 2 pounds of iron stone purchased on the shores of Lake Superior and transported to Pittsburgh. 2 pounds of coal mined in Connellsville and manufactured into coke and brought to Pittsburgh. 1/2 pound of limestone mined east of the Alleghenies and brought to Pittsburgh. A little manganese ore mined in Virginia and brought to Pittsburgh. And these 4.5 pounds of material manufactured into 1 pound of solid steel and sold for 1 cent. 1 cent! This was how efficient Carnegie was. And I'll finish the quote. That's all that need be said about the steel business. Well, it was a little more complicated than that, but Carnegie was able to concentrate on the basics of his business, and that's what led to his success. Now, at the same time that Andrew Carnegie was achieving such success in the steel business, John Rockefeller was becoming the king of the oil business. Unlike steel, steel had been around for centuries. It was a specialty product until it began to be produced on an industrial scale during this period, but it had been around for a long time. The oil business was something that was brand new. Yes, oil had seeped to the surface of the earth in parts of Russia and the Middle East, but it had been a bother. Nobody really had been looking for it until 1859, when a man named Drake in western Pennsylvania deliberately drilled for oil and struck oil. 1859, this is the beginning of the modern petroleum industry, and John D. Rockefeller was one who got in on the ground floor. There was a gold rush, sort of. There was a rush to western Pennsylvania, to the oil fields of western Pennsylvania, that was very much like the gold rush to California a decade earlier. In fact, people spoke of oil as black gold. Rockefeller got into the oil business and quickly learned that the production of oil was something that offered little scope for gaining control of, because anybody could drill a well darn near any place. But the refining of oil, that was where somebody might make some money. So Rockefeller determined that he was going to get into the oil refining business. And very much like Andrew Carnegie in steel, Rockefeller focused on the production process. He focused on the ability to produce the refined products more cheaply than anyone else. He was an obsessive on this point. In fact, there's a story that goes that Rockefeller was visiting one of his plants one day. This was a plant that refined the oil into kerosene, which, now bear this in mind, and this is actually something that is quite surprising to most people when they hear it. It's true enough. John D. Rockefeller earned his vast fortune in oil before the days of the automobile. Oil in John Rockefeller's day was a lubricant. It wasn't yet a fuel. Now, oil would become huge, even huger in the 20th century after people began to burn it as fuel. Just consider what you know about your own car. You put gallons of gasoline in your gas tank every week. You put quarts of oil in your crankcase, every couple of months? But Rockefeller was able to make his fortune when oil was used as a lubricant rather than a fuel. But the way he did it was with his obsessive attention to cost. An employee who was watching Rockefeller one day described a visit by Rockefeller to the plant that was producing the kerosene and putting it in tin cans. And this is what he says. Here's Rockefeller coming onto the plant floor. Rockefeller watched a machine filling the tin cans. 12 cans stood on a wooden platform beneath 12 pipes. A man pulled a lever, and each discharged exactly 5 gallons of kerosene into a can. Still on a wooden carrier, the 12 cans were pushed along to another machine, wherein 12 tops were swiftly clamped fast onto the cans. Thence they were pushed to the last machine, in which just enough solder to fasten and seal the lid was dropped on each can. Now here he's describing just the way the kerosene was taken into the cans. It was all mechanized and it was the state of the art. But Rockefeller wasn't content with this. This quote continues, Mr. Rockefeller listened in silence while an expert told all about the various machines used to save labor and time and expense in the process. At last, Mr. Rockefeller asked, how many drops of solder do you use on each can? 40, came the answer. Have you tried 38? Said Rockefeller. No? Would you mind having some sealed with 38 and let me know? Well, they tried it, and they did 6 or 7 cans this way, and with 38 drops of solder, a few of them leaked. At which point, Rockefeller said, try 39. So they try and none leaked. And then it was tried with hundreds of cans and none of them leaked. Thereafter, every can was sealed with 39 drops of solder instead of 40. Now, this is a very small item. It's a very small thing. How much could 1 drop of solder cost? Not very much, but Rockefeller reckoned that multiplied over the thousands and thousands of cans that came out of his plant every month, this would be a way that they could save some money. It was largely as a result of this attention to detail, of his efficiency, that Rockefeller was able to seize the lion's share of the oil refining business. By 1870, Standard Oil Company controlled 90% of the refining capacity in the United States. Think about this for a minute. This is only 11 years after the first oil well was drilled in Pennsylvania. Rockefeller has his hands on the throat of the American oil industry. Now, in those days, there was nothing unusual about this. There was nothing illegal about this. But Rockefeller believed that he needed even greater control. Now, here's something that's worth bearing in mind about Rockefeller. It's peculiar to Rockefeller, but it's not entirely unique. Most individuals who achieve great success in business, at least in American business, are driven by more than a profit motive. They're driven by a vision that somehow they are going to make life better for people in America, maybe people in the world. In Rockefeller's case, it was his belief that he could deliver kerosene and other oil products more cheaply than anybody else could. He recognized that the principal obstacle to his achievement of this vision was the competition that he was forced to wage against other people in the business. To Rockefeller, competition was wasteful. Now, this is worth bearing in mind here because from the time of Adam Smith, one of the principal justifications of capitalism was that it's based on competition. The various entrepreneurs are forced to compete one with the other, and competition will bring out the best in each. What Rockefeller is aiming for is the end of competition. What he wants is a monopoly. He believed that competition was wasteful. He once likened competition and its wastefulness and his approach to business to growing roses. He was a rose fancier, and he knew that if you want to raise a prize rose, what you do is you go out in the spring when all the buds are coming out, and you look at the buds and you determine which bud is the healthiest, which is the fullest, which promises to be the strongest. And what do you do then? You cut off all the other buds so that the plant can focus all its attention, all its resources into this one bud. That was his vision of the oil business. And of course, the prize bud was going to be Standard Oil. Now, he engaged in what in our day would be considered illegal cutthroat practices. He quite typically lowered his price below costs in markets where he had competition, forcing those individuals to go out of business, or more typically, to sell to him. In fact, typically the way Rockefeller worked is he would send out his agents, and he would offer his competitors a fair price for their production capacity. And if they took it, he would either pay them in cash, or actually, he would often offer them shares of Standard Oil. In which case, this would often be a very good deal because if they held on to their Standard Oil stock, they would become wealthy. But if they didn't go along, if they said they were going to compete, well, then he would say, okay, you've had your chance, and he would then drive them out of business. He had such control over the market that he could force the shippers to give him rebates, secretly low prices for goods that he shipped on the trains. given himself what we would consider an unfair advantage over his competitors. By this means, he was able to forge an effective monopoly of the oil business. And it was at this point that the public began to take notice. There was an irony here. In Rockefeller's vision, the cost of the product he was selling to consumers, his 5-gallon or 2-gallon tin of kerosene, it continued to fall. He delivered on his vision. He delivered goods at lower prices, quality goods at lower prices. And so consumers saw that their standard of living vis-a-vis oil was improving. But Rockefeller couldn't avoid the enmity of the competitors that he ran out of business, who decided that they needed to go to Congress to pass laws against this sort of thing. Now, an argument could be made that the trust needed to be reined in. It's quite possible that John D. Rockefeller in the 1890s was certainly more powerful than governors of many states. At times, he might have been as powerful as the President of the United States. But he was utterly beyond public control. He answered to no one besides his own stockholders. And actually, he was the major stockholder of Standard Oil, so he answered primarily to himself and his board of directors. But at this time, the American public and American politicians began to think that something must be done to rein in Standard Oil, which was considered to be the worst of the monopolies. And when people spoke in those days, as they did, of the captains of industry, or even less complimentarily, about the robber barons, John D. Rockefeller was Exhibit A in the group of robber barons. And so in 1890, Congress passed the first federal antitrust law, the Sherman Antitrust Act, which didn't have much teeth and, in fact, had to be strengthened in the early part of the 20th century. In the first administration of Theodore Roosevelt, in the first 5 years of the 20th century, the Federal Justice Department brought an antitrust lawsuit, a criminal antitrust lawsuit against Standard Oil, succeeding in 1911 in gaining a decision by the Supreme Court that forced the breakup of the Standard Oil Trust. Rockefeller's advice, by the way, to investors, when he heard that the Supreme Court had rendered his decision, someone was asked, well, what do you advise investors now? He said, buy Standard Oil, which was in fact very good advice. Rockefeller himself recognized that Standard Oil might even be worth more in pieces than it was as a whole. Anyway, 1911 marks the end of the great era of industrial capitalism in the United States with the breakup of Standard Oil. And it shows a couple of things. It shows, one, that government decided that it had to step in and take action against these industrial behemoths. But it also reveals something else. And it's an irony of the development of American capitalism that capitalists, while they often use competition as a justification for what they do, as soon as they get in position to limit or, in fact, defeat competition entirely, often do so. We have a case here of John Rockefeller, who was perhaps one of the most successful American capitalists of all time, adhered to a philosophy that was utterly contradictory to the philosophical basis of capitalism itself. It's a tension that we'll see over and over again. And in fact, in a future lecture, we'll talk about John D. Rockefeller's heir, in certain respects, his philosophical heir, Bill Gates, and how Gates found himself subject to the same sort of political and governmental pressures that Rockefeller did. But that's enough about Rockefeller and Carnegie. In our next lecture, we're going to talk about the man who actually came out ahead of both Rockefeller and Carnegie, J.P. Morgan.
After listening to Lecture 5, a student posed this question to Professor Brands. Can you tell me a little about Rockefeller and Carnegie's philanthropy? Let's listen to the professor's response.
Each of Andrew Carnegie and John Rockefeller eventually became major philanthropists. There were those people who said this was to assuage their guilty consciences, considering all the nefarious things they had done in getting to the top. And to some degree, this is true. To some extent, it also reflects the fact that in each case, the individual involved realized that during their money-making years, their greatest contribution to the United States was probably making money, except they wouldn't have put it that way. They would have said their greatest contribution is to head the enterprises that build America, that produce the steel that builds America, that refines the petroleum that allows America to operate its trains and so on. And so during their productive years, they devoted most of their attention to production. But in each case, after retirement, each one realized that especially in those days before federal income tax. They had a whole lot more money than they were ever going to be able to spend, and they decided to turn to philanthropy. Andrew Carnegie was first. He always had something of a nagging conscience. There was enough of the memory of his father's lack of success as a result of the Industrial Revolution, and he knew that he was the beneficiary of being in the right place at the right time, as well as of having energy and all that stuff. And so he felt an obligation to give something back. His philosophy was spend your first 50 years making money, spend your next 50 years, should you live that long, giving it away. And he did give away a whole lot of money, and he devoted much of his time and energy after he retired in 1900 at the age of about 65 to things like international peace. The Carnegie Endowment for International Peace was endowed by Carnegie and was also operated by Carnegie for some years. He was a driving force behind that. Rockefeller, to some degree, followed along Carnegie's example. And so Carnegie kind of set the standard for philanthropists, and it seemed to be a reasonable compromise between the imperatives of making money and the concern of the hoi polloi, or the ordinary people, that these folks had far too much money than was good for them, and they therefore ought to give something back. And so this became a fairly common practice among people who became very seriously wealthy as a result of their business activities.